Welcome to RGES World Literature. This is lesson 27 on French literature. We're going to do a summary or a review today. It doesn't mean that you don't need to, I'm just hitting the highlights. You definitely need to continue to study the other notes as well. But because it was such a large section and there's so much to learn, let me just refresh what's going on as far as the big picture for you. So go ahead and, of course, be taking notes on this. Add this to your other notes on French literature. So first I'm going to write down the periods that we've learned. Okay, so these are the periods that we've learned about: the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance. We're thinking the time of the Renaissance and Reformation here, especially kind of the latter part of the Renaissance and into the Reformation period, the Classical period, Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then 19th century has, I would maybe then rather than numbering it that way, let me do it this way. I think of it more like this. The first half of the 19th century was Romanticism, and then we have Realism, and developing out of Realism. So Realism begins about the mid-century, and then afterwards, towards the latter quarter, perhaps, or so, of the 19th century, we have Naturalism and Parnasse, which is a literary movement developing at the same time. As we get into the 20th century here, we've got Surrealism and Symbolism beginning just about the turn of the century into the 20th century. Again, when I kind of bracket them, this means these two things are developing almost simultaneously, and then Existentialism and Absurdism. Now, I'm going to go through a brief, then summary of the major sections here so that you can kind of know what to emphasize as you're studying, because I recognize I've given you a lot of information here. With the Middle Ages then, now it doesn't mean that I would ask no question from anything else in your notes. That's not what I mean, but these are the highlights, okay? So pay special attention to these things. When you think of the Middle Ages, you want to think about the epic, you want to think about the romances, you want to think about the 3M plays, Rabelais. Okay. When we think about the epic, you're thinking Song of Roland. Again, you should already have these in your notes, but again, I'm trying to give you an overview here. The romances, we're thinking King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table, as well as Tristan and Isolde, or Isolde, depending on the spelling and who you're referring to. The 3 M's would be our mystery plays about Jesus Christ, our morality plays about virtues, vices, the life of man, that kind of thing, and our miracle plays. And we might think Jesus when we think of miracles, but also traditionally to become a saint, okay, it was about doing a miracle. And so these were the ones about saints. Fableau, you want to associate with both satire, stories, and also the animal stories. In particular, Reynard the Fox and his adventures. Whoops, Reynard. When we think of the Renaissance, this is primarily an age of poetry. We have Rabelais, and that's Gargantua and Pantagruel, the two giants, remember, a lot similar flavor to Gulliver's Travels, and Montaigne, known for his essays. When we think of the classical period, classical period now. We've moved into the 17th century. You want to think of your philosophers. They're major writers as well, but we're not writing fiction here, okay? Descartes and Pascal, Corneille, who's the father of French tragedy, and Fontaine, known for his fables. So go ahead and write those notes down, and then I'll turn to the next page. Okay, now we come to the Enlightenment period. Now we're thinking the 18th century. We're got a lot about political thought, the philosophers. First century here of prose as far as fictional prose. Okay, we haven't seen much of that. Prose has primarily been for intellectual communication of ideas and not for fiction. But now we have prose in fiction, and especially the novel, the development of the novel, early novels now. Okay, so we have Voltaire, and his work was Candide. We have Rousseau, the work is Julie, or New Heloise. He also has his work on education that he puts in a story form, and that's it. So it's kind of almost a fiction work, a novel work, an early novel. The early novels have a different feel with them than they develop later. They're more storytelling to communicate ideas, basically. And so that's definitely what this is. This is a work on education, but puts it in a story form, and Diderot, who wrote the first encyclopedia. This would be first modern French encyclopedia. You could kind of think of Aristotle as writing. We didn't traditionally call it an encyclopedia so much, but he's kind of like the precursor to the encyclopedia. All right, so Romanticism then. Now we've moved into the 19th century, and we have Romanticism and Realism are the two major groups, and then working out of Realism would come Naturalism and Parnasse. So we're going to talk about Realism next. Okay, I do want you to know this particularly. Please go back and review the entire section on this, but we could think of the 5 main characteristics of Romanticism as being exotic, oriental, thinking of nature, myth, and nationalism. Okay. It is subjective. It isn't about the common man as much as individual expression. But these are specific. I want you to know those 5. 3 types of novels. The historical novel. We think of Sir Walter Scott in England. The Gothic novel. Whoops, let me get that a little larger there, sorry. The Gothic novel, I think of Wuthering Heights as very typical of that. And the romance. I probably think of Jane Eyre as a good example of a romanticism novel that's considered a romance novel. Okay. When we think of this phrase, we associate this with Romanticism, and it means it's different than what's happening in England. Okay, there's kind of an optimism as we move down towards realism. There's less of that, but the first half of the century is much more optimistic. But France had a different history, and it just came out of the French Revolution and the Napoleon Revolution. And so it is the le mal du siècle, or however I would pronounce that, and it is the pain of the century, of the pain of the century. And so there is definite melancholy spirit in French literature at this time. Now, not awful, but I don't mean bad. I love Hugo, and Dumas is fun, and interesting to me. But Hugo, of course, is our master of this period, very characteristic, kind of the king of French Romanticism. He has The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Les Miserables, but sad, in many ways, sad, serious works, okay? And so we're following the history of the period and the weight that's on maybe the French consciousness at this time. So we think of a couple good novels for him. You should know those. Dumas, of course, we've got The Count of Monte Cristo, which you've read, through the whole Three Musketeers series of several books, and Man in the Iron Mask, which actually has the Three Musketeers appearing in that one also. So these are two chief authors. The third most significant author of this time is Vigny. And he is known mostly as, well, he's a very prolific writer, and also this is a time of poetry and prose. Okay, the novel is being well developed, and there's a lot of poetry being written as well. But he is also known for his first translation of Shakespeare's works, or a major translation of Shakespeare's works into the French. Okay, in the middle of the 19th century, we're moving to the Realism period. We're now focused more on society, on reform, on struggle, and on the common man. So this is our focus. Our three main authors: Stendhal, The Red and the Black, the Charterhouse of Parnasse. Wait a minute. Did I get that right? I did not pronounce. Wait a minute. Of Parma. There we go. I thought that's confusing, that word. There we go. Parma. Balzac, The Human Comedy. This is over 100 novels concatenated together and viewed as one large story or history of man and his development, or the different classes, the different types of people, whatever. And Flaubert would be Madame Bovary. I might be pronouncing that wrong, actually. I've written it many times and have no idea that I've ever actually heard her name pronounced. And Sentimental Education, so 2 works for that. So in the Realism period, reaching down back and referring here to the Romanticism period in this. Okay. Now, next one then that develops out of that is Naturalism. When we think of Naturalism, you can think of nature in many ways. This is like the word romantic can be thought of in many different connotations, but what we're thinking here is nature as a powerful force, okay, that is not governed by God or anything. This is a non-theistic philosophy. So now nature, this would be the forces of heredity and the environment, okay, are opposing man. It represents a struggle for man, represents a conflict, represents a problem, but there's nothing benign or even purposeful about it. So I always think of Red Badge of Courage as a naturalism novel. Okay, so if you're familiar with that one, that might help you here. We want to associate the name Guy Maupassant. Known for a lot of short stories that he wrote, as well as some novels. Okay, but I don't have a title for him that you need to know. Parnasse is a literary movement. They're all literary movements. It's a poetic movement where we're back to rigid form. It's interesting how often this pendulum swing occurs. And emotional detachment. And the name you want to associate with that would be Sorry, I had to go back and check. I actually gave you no particular person to associate with the poets there. But I did want to throw in at this point Jules Verne, because during this same period of time, we have this early sci-fi development. And so Jules Verne, really in many ways, I think a delightful author of novels, prolific writer of novels. I think of Around the World in 80 Days, and Journey to the Center of the Earth. There's several others. And so these are novels of this same time period. All right. Now, then we're moving into the 20th century, and we have 4 more ideas that we covered just last time. And so I'm going to be very brief with these. So now, remember, Surrealism has to do with thinking. It's more than maybe the materialistic or the physical realism realm, where now we're starting to think about other aspects of our personalities beyond the surface, maybe, of action and thinking. Okay, so we're talking about Surrealism, thinking a lot about the subconscious mind and what's other influences on the human being. This would be kind of the early turn of the century awareness of psychology, that kind of thing. This would spring out of automatic writing, where you're just writing what's coming to your mind with little attempt to filter it or parse it, or even have a lot of direct connection in your thoughts. And we went over that quite a bit in our last tape. And Andre Breton is the name of the guy you want to associate with that. Symbolism, a new category, has to do with the imaginations, very subtle, dreamlike, remember we said to evoke an impression more than describe. And free verse means no direct rhythm pattern, no direct rhyme pattern. And then we gave you some authors that were not French to associate with, just to help you think about what it feels like. So you don't have to be able to tell me William Blake or T.S. Eliot, but if those are authors you know, poets you know, then you can get a feel for what symbolism looks like here. Now we'll extend to the very last 2 ideas here that again are a review: existentialism and absurdism on the last page. Existentialism has to do with the view that the world is meaningless. Situations just happen to us, or we're an embodiment of all the different influences that press upon us, and we're trying to live as whole people, authentic people in the midst of this. So create some personal meaning or personal space in the midst of a meaningless world. Jean-Paul Sartre is the guy you want to associate with this, and we gave you the 2 works, No Exit and The Crucible. He's written many more. And finally, absurdism would be, it seems in many ways to be a very similar genre, or, well, absurdism, hang on. And it's coined really because Albert Camus, who many others were calling an existentialism, did not desire that term. He wasn't willing to take that on himself, but I think he's maybe emphasizes the idea that it may be meaningless or it may just be inscrutable. But at either way, we cannot penetrate it. It's not penetratable if there is some larger meaning in the universe. And so his 2 works that we asked you to know are The Stranger and The Plague, and he's the man to associate with that. So hopefully this review then will help you sift out the biggest ideas here, and I would recommend highly that you continue to study that. You'll probably be asked on a test to summarize and gather together much information, as well as knowing certain specific identities, works, authors, etc. Okay, so know the specific facts, but also I'm very interested in you being able to trace the major development of French literature. Okay, that's going to end this tape, and have a wonderful day.